The classroom was silent, too silent. Chalk dust lingered in the air, caught in a thin beam of afternoon sunlight slicing through the window. The smell of old wood and ink clung to the room, heavy and stale. Every student sat frozen, eyes wide, breaths held. At the center of it all stood Daniel. His fists trembled against the scarred wooden desk, knuckles white, veins sharp beneath his skin. His chest heaved as though he had been holding back for years, and something inside had finally snapped. "You think money makes you better than me?" His voice cracked on the last word, but it rang out like a slap. It bounced off the walls, off the rows of staring faces, until it hung there, unanswered. Across from him, seated with rigid posture, was Ethan. His blazer was pressed to perfection, his hair gleamed with careful grooming, and his silver pen rested neatly beside a spotless notebook. He didn't rise. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared at Daniel, calm and unnervingly quiet, as if he were calculating every possible response and discarding them all. That silence was worse than laughter, worse than insult. It was dismissal, the kind only someone born with wealth and confidence could wield. A nervous cough broke the air, then the screech of a chair leg against the tiled floor. Students leaned forward, their curiosity almost electric. The classroom was no longer a place of learning. It had become an arena. At the chalkboard, the teacher froze mid-sentence. Her hand, still holding a stick of chalk, hovered in the air, as if time itself had paused. She looked from Daniel to Ethan, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came. Even she seemed caught in the gravity of this confrontation. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. His whole life, every insult, every whisper about him being different, every pitying glance was boiling inside his chest. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about everything Ethan represented. And still, Ethan didn't move. His silence was like a wall. "Say something!" Daniel barked, his voice raw. The rich boy tilted his head ever so slightly, like a king acknowledging a commoner. His lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smirk. Not cruel, not mocking, just unreadable. The air in the room grew heavier. A storm had broken loose, but the first lightning bolt had not yet struck. For a split second, Daniel saw himself reflected in Ethan's eyes, small, furious, desperate to be seen. And for that same split second, he wondered what Ethan saw in him. But before anything else could be said, before anyone dared to intervene, Daniel realized something. This wasn't the start of a fight. This was the start of everything. The moment that would twist his life into directions he had never imagined. The moment that would bind him, whether in hatred, rivalry, or something far more complicated, to the rich boy sitting just an arm's length away. To understand how they reached this breaking point, how the orphan ended up shouting in the face of privilege, we need to go back. Back to the day Daniel first walked into that classroom with nothing but a battered backpack and the weight of his past trailing behind him. The first morning Daniel stepped into that classroom, the world seemed to close in on him. His shoes were worn thin, the soles whispering against the floor with every step. The navy blue school shirt clung to his thin frame, a shade lighter from too many washes. He gripped the strap of his faded backpack as though it might anchor him in place. The smell of chalk and polished wood filled his nose, but it didn't calm him. If anything, it sharpened his nerves. The room was alive with chatter and laughter, easy, careless laughter that belonged to children who had never worried about where their next meal might come from. Gold watches gleamed on wrists that tapped across glossy desks. Pens clicked in fingers that had never gone cold in the dark of an orphanage. The sound of coins jingling in pockets, the smell of sweet pastries smuggled from home, every detail screamed of a life Daniel didn't belong to. And then he saw him, Ethan. He sat near the window, the sunlight spilling over his neatly combed hair, catching the shine of the silver pen resting in his hand. His blazer was tailored, not simply worn. His posture was straight, the kind taught by fathers who expected discipline and mothers who hired tutors to polish every imperfection. Ethan didn't look up at first. He didn't need to. He carried the quiet authority of someone who already knew he was the center of attention. "Class," the teacher announced, her smile polite, rehearsed. "This is Daniel. He'll be joining us from today." Dozens of eyes turned at once. Daniel's throat tightened. His palms itched with sweat. He forced a small nod, though his voice caught before he could manage a greeting. Whispers rolled like waves across the room. "Where's he from? Look at his bag. He doesn't belong here." A laugh, sharp, short, cut through the air. Daniel didn't look to see who it was. He already knew. The teacher, unfazed, pointed toward an empty desk. "You can sit by Ethan." For a second, Daniel thought he'd misheard. But no, there it was, the seat beside the boy, who seemed to have everything. He walked slowly, every step echoing in his head. When he pulled out the chair, it scraped loudly against the floor. He lowered himself onto it, careful not to brush against Ethan, careful not to breathe too loudly. For a moment, the world shrank to that shared desk. Daniel could feel Ethan's presence, close but distant, like a fire that gave light but no warmth. He smelled faintly of leather and cedarwood, a fragrance that belonged in houses with grand staircases and locked cabinets. Daniel knew it because he'd once seen it in a store window, priced higher than anything he could imagine affording. Neither of them spoke. Daniel kept his eyes on the wooden grain of the desk, tracing the grooves with his fingertips. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, like the charged air before a storm. Finally, Ethan shifted, his pen tapping once against his notebook. He didn't look at Daniel, but his words were quiet, deliberate. "Don't expect me to talk to you." Daniel froze. His lips parted, but no sound came. He wasn't sure if it was cruelty, indifference, or simply honesty. He swallowed hard and turned his gaze to the board, pretending the words hadn't stung, pretending his heart wasn't already pounding with anger and something else he couldn't yet name. That was the beginning. The moment the orphan was placed beside the heir, and though neither of them could have known it then, that seat would become the place where everything in their lives began to unravel. Days turned into weeks, and the invisible wall between Daniel and Ethan grew taller with every passing hour. It wasn't just Ethan, it was the entire class. They carried their privilege like a second skin, unaware of how it gleamed. Watches with polished faces caught the light, shoes clicked sharply on the floor, and conversations drifted easily from family trips to distant countries, to summer homes by the sea, to dinners in restaurants Daniel had only ever seen on glowing signs outside windows. Daniel tried to disappear into the background. He kept his head down, his books stacked neatly, his answers ready when teachers called on him. But in a place where silence was weakness, his quietness only invited ridicule. "Look at his pencil," one boy muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Daniel's stub of a pencil, sharpened down to the metal, sat awkwardly between his fingers. "Doesn't he even own a proper pen?" Another chimed in. Laughter rippled through the room, bouncing off the walls like cruel music. Daniel's ears burned. His grip tightened around the pencil until the wood threatened to snap. He didn't look at them. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Through it all, Ethan sat unmoving. He didn't join in the laughter, but he didn't stop it either. His eyes stayed fixed on the board, his jaw set, as though the whole thing had nothing to do with him. But Daniel felt it. That silence. That choice. Ethan's refusal to defend him was almost worse than the taunts. At lunch, the divide grew sharper. The cafeteria buzzed, with groups clustered around long tables, trading food and stories. Daniel carried his tray, an apple and a slice of bread, toward the farthest corner. He sat alone, head bent, pretending to focus on the crumbs. Laughter erupted from Ethan's table. A group of boys leaned close, listening to him recount something about his father's business trip. Even the way he held his fork seemed effortless, like the world itself bent around his ease. Daniel chewed his bread slowly, every bite dry and heavy. That night, lying on the hard mattress of the orphanage, he replayed the day in his head. The pencil, the laughter, Ethan's silence. The ache in his chest gnawed deeper than hunger. But the story didn't end there. One afternoon in math, the teacher scribbled a problem across the board, complicated, twisted with symbols and numbers. Daniel's hand shot up before he could stop himself. He walked to the board, chalk in hand, and solved it step by step. His method was different, less polished, but it worked. When he turned, the room was quiet, and for the first time, Ethan was watching him, really watching. His eyes weren't cold or dismissive. They were sharp, focused, almost curious. "You solve problems differently," Ethan said later under his breath. Daniel frowned.
Is that bad?
Ethan's lips twitched, a flicker of something like interest.
Not bad, just
different, Daniel blinked, caught off guard. It was the first time Ethan had spoken directly to him. The words weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either. They hung between them, strange and unsettling, like a bridge half built over a chasm. For Daniel, it was enough to keep him awake that night. The laughter of the others still rang in his ears, but now there was something else. A question: why had Ethan noticed him at all? Night was always the hardest. The orphanage grew still after lights out, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the heavy, restless quiet of a place where dozens of children lay awake, staring into the dark, waiting for sleep that rarely came. Pipes rattled in the walls. A draft crept under the cracked window frame. The thin blanket Daniel pulled over his shoulders did little to keep out the cold. He lay on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the faint snores and occasional coughs from the bunks around him. The matron's words echoed in his head, sharp and unrelenting. "Remember, boy, you're lucky to even have a place here. Don't expect too much from life." It was a mantra she repeated often, as though reminding him of his place in the world. Sometimes Daniel wondered if she truly believed it, or if she wanted him to. He pressed his fists against his chest, holding in the ache, because the truth was he did expect more. Not gifts, not handouts, not charity. He wanted something no one could hand to him. He wanted dignity, a reason to lift his chin when people looked his way. In the stillness, fragments of memory rose like smoke. A lullaby, half forgotten, hummed in a soft voice. The scent of warm bread baking in an oven. The faint feel of strong arms lifting him high into the air. Laughter bubbling in his ears. His parents' faces were hazy now, blurred by the years. He was too young when the accident took them. But sometimes, if he closed his eyes and concentrated, he could almost hear his mother calling his name, the syllables stretching like a lifeline. Then the memory would break apart. Silence. Emptiness. Daniel turned onto his side, blinking back the sting in his eyes. He hated crying in the dark. It felt like surrender. And surrender was something he promised himself he would never do. He whispered into the hollow of the night, a vow that no one else could hear. "I'll prove them wrong. All of them." The words steadied him, even if only for a moment. The next morning, when he walked into class and took his seat beside Ethan, he sat a little straighter. He didn't let the whispers get under his skin. His hands didn't tremble when he pulled out his pencil. He forced himself to meet the board with steady eyes to answer when the teacher called, to show he wasn't invisible. Ethan noticed. He didn't say anything, but Daniel felt the shift. The boy beside him glanced sideways more often than before, as though studying him. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even kindness. But it was something, and for Daniel, that was enough to keep walking forward, to keep believing that the life he was trapped in wasn't the only one waiting for him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet imagine, was that the boy beside him, the heir who carried the weight of a different world, would soon play a part in that promise. For better or worse, their fates were already tangled. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the clouds were gathering. The weeks rolled on, and the line dividing Ethan and Daniel should have stayed solid.
Rich and poor.
Heir and orphan.
Worlds apart, but something shifted.
Small things at first, barely noticeable, like hairline cracks in a stone wall. It happened one afternoon in history class. The teacher was droning on, pointing at a map sprawled across the blackboard. A mistake slipped out, an error about a date that Daniel had memorized weeks ago from the battered library book he read at night.
His hand shot up before he could second-guess himself. "Excuse me, sir."
That year's wrong. The teacher blinked, frowned, checked his notes. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. And then, quietly, grudgingly, he admitted Daniel was right. When Daniel sat down again, he could feel the weight of the stares. Some mocking, some annoyed, some surprised. But the strangest gaze of all came from the boy next to him, Ethan. His head tilted just slightly, eyes fixed on Daniel with a spark of something that looked like interest. He didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes. He simply said, under his breath, "You're sharper than you look." Daniel blinked, unsure if it was meant as a compliment or an insult. Maybe both. Either way, it lodged in his chest and stayed there. Another day, it was the cafeteria. Daniel's tray was bare, an apple, a slice of bread. Across the table, Ethan's plate overflowed with sandwiches and fruit, untouched, as he joked with his circle of friends. Then, without warning, Ethan slid half of his sandwich across the table toward Daniel.
No words, no explanation.
Just the gesture. Daniel stared at it, wary. Why? Ethan didn't look at him. I wasn't hungry, but Daniel knew better. He saw the flicker in Ethan's eyes, the kind of look that said it wasn't pity, exactly, but it wasn't indifference either. Something in between. Something complicated. That night, Daniel lay awake replaying the moment, confused. The heir of a wealthy family giving food to the orphan? It felt dangerous, like stepping onto a bridge that might not hold, and yet it wasn't just food or words. Ethan started noticing things. When Daniel's notebook tore, Ethan passed him a spare without a word. When other boys whispered insults under their breath, Ethan's silence didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt protective, as though his quietness was a shield, subtle but intentional. The cracks in the armor were there, faint but undeniable. Still, Daniel didn't trust it. He couldn't. Years of being pushed aside had taught him that kindness often came with strings, that sooner or later someone would remind him where he truly belonged, so he stayed cautious. He took the sandwich but didn't say thank you. He accepted the notebook but kept his guard up, but something inside him was shifting too. A whisper he couldn't ignore. Maybe the rich boy wasn't untouchable after all. Maybe beneath the polish and pride, there was a human being, and maybe, just maybe, that was even more dangerous than cruelty. Because kindness could pull down walls faster than hatred ever could. And deep down, Daniel knew those walls were about to be tested in ways neither of them could escape. The first frost of winter glazed the schoolyard when the announcement came. Daniel was shivering at his desk, rubbing his hands together, when the teacher cleared her throat and spoke over the murmur of the class. This year's academic debate will be held next month. The prize? She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. A full scholarship to the Academy's summer program in London. The room erupted. Voices rose, chairs squeaked, excitement buzzed through the air like static. For most of the students, it was another feather in their cap, another trip to add to a long list of opportunities. But for Daniel, the words hit like thunder.
A scholarship, an escape.
A chance to prove he was more than the charity case they all whispered about. His heart raced.
He wanted it.
More than anything, names were read aloud, carefully chosen by the faculty. And when Daniel's was called, he nearly stopped breathing, but then another name followed.
Ethan's. The air seemed to thicken around them.
Daniel turned his head slowly, and there was Ethan, straight-backed, composed, his face unreadable. Their eyes locked, and in that gaze was something different. Not disdain, not indifference. Challenge. After class, Ethan broke the silence first. His voice was low even, but edged with steel. I won't go easy on you. Daniel's jaw clenched. Good, I don't need you to. The tension between them sharpened instantly, a blade forged from pride and desperation. Around them, other students sensed it too. Whispers flew, bets were made. The orphan against the air. Nobody expected it to be close. That night, the contrast between their worlds grew clearer than ever. Ethan sat in his study, books lined neatly across a mahogany desk. A lamp cast golden light on pages filled with notes. Tutors came and went, offering guidance, strategies, rehearsed speeches, polished until they gleamed. Outside his window, the manicured lawn was dusted with snow. Across town, Daniel hunched under the dim flicker of a single bulb at the orphanage. His notebook was torn at the edges, his pen sputtered when he pressed too hard. He scoured borrowed library books, piecing together arguments, scribbling until his hand cramped. No tutors, no polished strategies, just determination and the kind of hunger no rich boy could understand. The two boys prepared in silence, each unaware of how closely the other worked, each driven by a fire they couldn't name. For Ethan, it was pride, the need to remain untouchable, to never let the orphan overshadow him. For Daniel, it was survival, the need to be seen, to grasp at a chance that might never come again. The divide that once kept them apart was no longer just about wealth or class. It was about something far sharper, the need to win. And as the day of the debate drew closer, the storm that had been simmering between them for months finally began to gather strength. Two boys, two worlds.
One stage waiting, and a collision that would leave neither of them unchanged.
The debate hall smelled faintly of polished wood and anticipation. Rows of seats were packed, every space filled with students, teachers, and a few parents who had come to watch the event that had already become the talk of the school. The stage itself gleamed under the bright spotlights. Two podiums stood like opposing towers, waiting. On one side, Ethan, on the other, Daniel. Ethan stepped forward first. He adjusted his blazer with effortless precision, his silver pen tucked neatly into his pocket like a badge of authority. When he began to speak, his voice carried easily, smooth, measured, confident. Every word was deliberate, polished like glass. He quoted philosophers, drew on history, wove statistics into elegant arguments. His tone never faltered, his expression never cracked. The audience nodded, impressed, some even scribbling notes as though they were learning from him. When he finished, applause rose like a wave. Ethan bowed his head slightly, the perfect image of composure. Then it was Daniel's turn. He walked to the podium with his notebook clutched tightly in his hand, the edges frayed and bent. His legs felt heavy, but his eyes scanned the audience with something raw, something unpolished. For a moment, the silence threatened to crush him. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and uneven. And then, slowly, he spoke. At first, his voice was rough, uncertain, but it carried truth. He didn't recite rehearsed lines or polished quotes. He told stories, his stories. He spoke about growing up in an orphanage, about learning, not from books filled with privilege, but from scraps of life, from hunger, from the sheer will to endure. The question isn't just about what's written in a book, Daniel said, gripping the edges of the podium. It's about what we live through. Some people, his eyes flicked toward Ethan, inherit wisdom. Others have to carve it out of the dark with their bare hands. The hall was still. Students leaned forward. Teachers exchanged glances. His words weren't elegant, but they cut deeper. They burned with the kind of authenticity no rehearsed argument could match. Daniel's voice grew stronger with each sentence, as if he were drawing from a well inside himself he hadn't realized was there. By the time he finished, his chest heaving, there was no doubt the audience had been moved, and then came the eruption. Applause broke out, not polite, but fierce. Some students stood. Others clapped until their palms stung. Ethan's jaw tightened as he stood motionless beside his podium. For the first time, the heir's mask slipped. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something deeper, something unsettled. Daniel returned to his seat, heart racing, still catching his breath. For once the whispers around him weren't mocking. They were different. He had been seen. Ethan glanced at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, envy, respect, or perhaps both. The storm that had been building between them wasn't over. The debate had only cracked the sky, and what came next would decide whether that lightning burned everything down or lit the path forward. The debate ended, but the echoes of Daniel's words hung in the air long after the applause died down. Students spilled into the corridors buzzing with excitement, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some said Daniel had won, not because of perfect delivery, but because he had spoken from somewhere Ethan could never touch. Others argued Ethan's arguments were still sharper, cleaner. The school was divided, and for the first time, Ethan wasn't standing unchallenged at the top. Daniel slipped out of the hall, clutching his notebook against his chest. His pulse still raced, adrenaline surging through him like fire.
He had never felt so alive, so raw, so terrified.
The praise he overheard in the hallway, that orphan kid. Did you hear him? He was brilliant. Felt almost unreal, but with every word of admiration came a shadow of fear. He knew Ethan wouldn't let it go. Sure enough, as Daniel rounded the corner toward the courtyard, he heard the sharp echo of expensive shoes against tile.
Ethan was behind him. Not bad, Ethan said, his voice smooth, but there was steel beneath it.
You've learned how to perform.
I'll give you that. Daniel stopped, slowly turning to face him.
It wasn't a performance, he said quietly. It was the truth. Ethan's smile was thin, brittle. Truth? Don't kid yourself. People like you use words like truth because you don't have facts or logic or refinement. You play with pity.
That's all you have. Daniel clenched his fists, heat rising in his chest.
And what do you have, Ethan? Your father's money? His name, his shadow.
Everything you've done, every step you've taken, it's because the world laid it at your feet. For the first time, Ethan's mask cracked.
His jaw tightened. You think it's easy?
Having everything? It isn't. You wouldn't understand. You're too busy scraping by, waiting for people to feel sorry for you. The words hit like blows, but Daniel didn't back down.
He stepped closer, his voice low, trembling not with fear, but with fury. You don't get it?
I don't want pity. I don't want handouts.
All I've ever wanted is a chance to prove I'm more than what I came from. And today, I proved it. Not to them. He jabbed a finger toward the distant hall.
To myself.
That's something you'll never understand because you've never had to fight for it. The courtyard was silent except for the sound of their breathing. The air was thick, electric, charged with years of resentment neither had spoken aloud until now. For a moment, Ethan looked as though he might lash out. His hand curled into a fist at his side, his lips pressed into a thin line. But instead of striking, he laughed, short, bitter, hollow. You think you've won something today? He said, voice sharp as glass. You've just made yourself a target.
And trust me, Daniel, targets don't last long in this world. He turned and walked away.
His shoulders stiff, his shadow stretching long across the courtyard. Daniel stood frozen, his chest heaving, Ethan's words echoing in his skull.
A target. The applause of the crowd still rang in his ears, but now it mixed with something darker, an unspoken promise of retaliation. The storm between them hadn't passed.
It had only found its breaking point. The days after the debate carried a strange weight. The school still buzzed with talk of Daniel's speech, but beneath the noise, something quieter brewed. Whispers, rumors, questions about who Daniel really was. At first, he ignored them. He buried himself in homework, kept his head low, and tried not to notice how eyes lingered on him longer than usual. But the tension was impossible to avoid. Even the teachers seemed to study him differently now, as if they were trying to place a face they should have recognized. One afternoon, Daniel returned to the orphanage after school to find the director waiting for him at the door. Her face pale, troubled. "Daniel," she said softly, "we need to talk." Her office smelled faintly of old paper and tea, a place Daniel usually found comforting.
"Not today."
On the desk lay a file, its edges worn from years of storage. "This came across my desk," she said, sliding it toward him. "I didn't know whether to show you, but after everything, I think you deserve the truth." Daniel hesitated, then opened the file. Inside were documents he'd never seen before: his birth certificate, sealed adoption records, and a letter in handwriting he didn't recognize. His hands trembled as he read the name scrawled across the top. Alexander Sterling. The surname burned into him. Sterling, Ethan's family. His breath caught.
This can't be right." The director's eyes were heavy with sympathy.
"Your mother worked for them, Daniel. Before you were born, she was young, scared. When she passed, you were left here, but it seems there was more to the story. She wanted to keep you connected to your family, but..." Her voice faltered.
Things got complicated. Daniel's mind spun.
The letters blurred before his eyes. Ethan, his rival, his tormentor.
His blood?
He stumbled out of the office, the file pressed against his chest, as though it might vanish if he let go. The night air outside was cold, biting, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were a storm: anger, confusion, betrayal, disbelief. The next day at school, he couldn't keep his eyes off Ethan. Every movement, every tilt of his head, every polished word. Suddenly, it all felt different. During lunch, Daniel approached him. His throat was dry, his voice unsteady. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan raised a brow, annoyed but curious. He followed Daniel into an empty classroom, shutting the door behind them. "What's this about?" he asked, crossing his arms. Daniel threw the file onto the desk between them. "Read it." Ethan frowned, flipping through the documents. His expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to something darker. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted to Daniel's. "This is a joke," Ethan said, his voice low. "Some kind of cruel trick." "It's not," Daniel said, his voice breaking.
"I didn't believe it either, but it's real. Your family, my family."
"We're not just rivals, Ethan. We're brothers." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a long time, Ethan said nothing. He just stared at Daniel, his face unreadable, his fists trembling at his sides. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "Impossible." But the look in his eyes betrayed him. It wasn't denial, it was fear. The truth had unraveled, and with it, everything they thought they knew about each other. The days that followed were heavy with silence.
Daniel barely slept.
Ethan barely spoke. The revelation had cracked something between them that neither insults nor rivalry could mend. At first, Ethan avoided him. He stopped showing up at the usual lunch table, left classes early, and disappeared down hallways without a word. Daniel expected it.
After all, what were they supposed to do?
Pretend the truth hadn't changed everything? But the weight of it wouldn't let Daniel rest. He had lived his whole life with no family, no anchor, just the idea that he was alone in the world. Now, suddenly, the boy who had made him feel smaller than anyone else was his brother. One evening, Daniel found himself standing in front of the Sterling estate. The gates loomed tall and ironclad, the kind of place he had only ever passed from a distance. His hands trembled as he pressed the buzzer. The door opened not long after, and Ethan stood there in the threshold, his face pale, his eyes sharp but tired. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside, allowing Daniel in. The house smelled faintly of leather and oak. Chandeliers gleamed overhead. Portraits of ancestors stared down from gilded frames. Daniel felt like an intruder, his shoes too worn, his jacket too thin for such a place. They ended up in a study where the fire crackled low in the hearth. For a long time, neither said anything. The only sound was the pop of burning wood. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "My father," he said quietly. He knew. Daniel's chest tightened. "What?" Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the flames.
"He told me once, a long time ago. Said there were
complications, that she worked for us, that she left with secrets."
I didn't believe him. I didn't want to." His voice cracked, just slightly. "And now here you are?" Daniel swallowed hard.
"Why didn't you say anything?" "Because," Ethan snapped, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. "Because I hated you."
"I didn't want it to be true."
"If it was, then—"
"Everything I told myself about you, about me, it all falls apart." Daniel looked at him, really looked at him.
For the first time, Ethan didn't seem untouchable. He seemed like a boy trapped under the weight of a family name, as lost as Daniel had ever been. Slowly, Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out the frayed notebook. He set it on the desk between them. "This is all I've had, Ethan. My words, my stories.
No money, no legacy, just this." "But if we're brothers—"
"Maybe we don't have to keep tearing each other apart." Ethan stared at the notebook for a long time. His hands flexed, as though unsure whether to take it or push it away. At last, he whispered, "I don't know how to be your brother." Daniel managed a small, weary smile. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." The firelight flickered across their faces, softening the sharp edges. The rivalry that had defined them was still there, but beneath it was something new, fragile, uncertain, but real. Outside, the night stretched wide and quiet. The world hadn't changed, but for Daniel and Ethan, everything had. And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel like an orphan anymore. If you were moved by Daniel and Ethan's journey, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story that will stay with you long after it ends.